Why was everyone staring at her, as if she didn't belong? Lieutenant Commander Nora Callaway stood at the gates of the Naval Academy with the September sun cutting through the Maryland air, the faint tang of salt water drifting in from the Chesapeake. The flag rippled above the parade ground. Around her, midshipmen in crisp summer whites moved in formation, perfectly aligned, perfectly confident, like they were born to belong here. And then from behind her, a voice cut through the air. "Watch it, lady." She turned just as a shoulder brushed past her. 4 midshipmen, young, loud, laughing, faces she didn't recognize but instantly understood. They had that careless arrogance of those who hadn't yet failed. One of them, tall, sandy-haired, looked her up and down. Civilian jacket, jeans, no rank insignia, no reason for them to salute. He smirked. "You lost." Nora kept her tone even. "No, I know where I'm going." "Visitor tour are that way," another one said, jerking his chin toward the visitor center. "This area's for midshipmen." The third one chuckled. "Yeah, this ain't open house, ma'am." And then came the line that would stay with her longer than she wanted. "You don't belong here, lady." Something inside her tightened, but only for a moment. She didn't react, didn't even flinch. She'd been in worse storms, on darker nights, with missiles on radar screens and alarms screaming in her ears. This was nothing. She stepped aside, said quietly, "Have a good day, gentlemen," and started walking toward Bancroft Hall. That was when it happened. A sharp sound, a spit, followed by laughter. She felt the wet slap on her shoulder, the slow drip down the collar of her jacket. The laughter behind her grew louder. Nora stopped. She didn't turn immediately. For 3 seconds she just stood there, the world around her shrinking to the thump of her pulse and the faint sound of flags snapping in the wind. Then she turned, slowly, and met their eyes. The one who spat was still grinning. His friends looked nervous now, but none of them spoke. None of them apologized. They just waited to see what she would do. She did nothing. No words, no glare, just that cold, level look, the kind that freezes an entire room when given by someone who's been there, done it, survived worse. Then she turned and kept walking. Their laughter followed her halfway to the steps of Bancroft Hall. Inside, she found a restroom, shut the door, and stared at herself in the mirror. Civilian clothes, wet collar, a faint tremor in her jaw. Her reflection looked tired, not from the long flight or the travel, but from what the uniform once represented and what it no longer seemed to mean to them. She pulled a paper towel from the dispenser, cleaned the collar, and spoke under her breath, quiet, controlled. "You're better than this, Nora. Don't let them see it." Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Respect isn't given, it's earned. But disrespect, that reveals who they are, not who you are." She looked at herself one last time in the mirror, then left the restroom without a word. That night in her temporary quarters overlooking the yard, she unpacked slowly. Her uniform hung neatly in the closet, pressed, clean, untouched. On the desk lay a single folder marked "Orders." She hadn't opened it since arriving. She didn't need to. She knew every word inside by heart. Lieutenant Commander Nora Callaway. Operations Officer, Leadership Training Division. Effective immediately. In 72 hours, she would be standing on that stage, introduced to the entire brigade of midshipmen as their new commanding officer for tactical leadership training. The same 4 young men who spat on her would be sitting in the audience, in uniform, standing at attention when her name was called. But for now, they didn't know, and she wasn't going to tell them. She leaned back in the chair, eyes tracing the ceiling. Her chest felt heavy, like the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work but from memory. Her father's voice again. "Leadership isn't about power, Nora. It's about how you carry yourself when no one's watching." When she was a child, she'd followed him across bases from Norfolk to Yokosuka, always impressed whites, always saluted, always respected. Rear Admiral James Callaway, every sailor knew the name. His calm command presence could silence a room without raising his voice. When he passed away 2 years ago, Nora had been deployed in the Pacific. She still remembered the coded message over the comms, the flight home, the folded flag pressed into her hands at Arlington. Now that flag sat framed in a shadow box on the wall of her quarters. Every time she looked at it, she felt the same quiet ache. She thought about the young men from earlier, the laughter, the arrogance, and wondered what her father would have said. Probably nothing. He would have just watched, waited, and taught them later what dignity looked like. Nora had earned her own lessons the hard way. 11 years ago, she'd graduated from this very academy, top of her class, nuclear engineering degree, first in line for surface warfare qualification. She'd gone on to serve aboard 2 destroyers, survived storms off Okinawa, and once stood in the engine room of a damaged cruiser during a missile attack in the Strait of Hormuz. The commanding officer had been incapacitated. She'd taken charge, coordinated the crew, kept the reactor systems online, and brought the ship home. For that, she'd been awarded the Navy Commendation Medal with a Combat V. She didn't talk about that night, not even to her mother, because what stayed with her wasn't the medal, it was the silence afterward. The smell of smoke and seawater, the quiet breathing of the sailors who trusted her when everything was falling apart. That was leadership. And that was what these midshipmen didn't yet understand. The next morning, the academy yard looked different. The laughter, the marching, the perfection, all part of a system she used to belong to. She watched from a distance as the same group of 4 walked past the chapel steps. She recognized their voices even before seeing their faces. Carter, Enzo, Devon, and Hayes. That's what their name tapes said when she'd glanced quickly the day before. She wanted to confront them, to say something, anything. But she didn't, not yet. Instead, she went to her first briefing at the training division, her uniform now perfectly pressed, rank visible, medals displayed, insignia gleaming. The officers she passed saluted her instantly. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome aboard, ma'am." She nodded, polite, professional, detached. Inside the conference room, senior officers were reviewing leadership development schedules for the semester. When she was introduced, Lieutenant Commander Nora Callaway, newly assigned operations officer, there was polite applause. Some recognized the name. A few whispered it quietly, Admiral Callaway's daughter. She ignored it. For the rest of the day, she reviewed training modules, drills, evaluation rubrics. On paper, it all looked efficient. But she knew paper didn't teach leadership. People did, mistakes did, humility did. That night after hours, she logged into the personnel system. With authorization, she opened the files for the 4 midshipmen. Carter, Enzo, Devon, Hayes. All first class, seniors, strong grades, leadership billets, no major disciplinary issues. Clean on paper. She read each profile carefully, nodding evaluations. Confident, assertive, natural leader. None of them mentioned empathy. None mentioned integrity. She closed the file. Outside her window, the academy was silent. The lights from the dorms reflected on the Severn River, shimmering faintly in the dark. She thought about the spit on her collar, the laughter, the mirror. Then she thought about Friday, the leadership assembly, when the commandant would announce her assignment to 4,000 midshipmen. She could almost see their faces already. And she wondered if they'd remember her. The morning of the assembly came with the sharp crack of the bugle and the rhythmic march of formations crossing the yard. The hall was filled with immaculate rows of white uniforms. The commandant spoke about honor, courage, commitment, the usual practiced words that hung heavy but familiar. Nora waited backstage, heartbeat steady, hands clasped behind her back. She could hear them calling her name. Lieutenant Commander Nora Callaway, new operations officer, leadership training division. A polite applause followed, then silence. Nora stepped into the light. 4,000 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and among them in the 4th row were the same 4 midshipmen, stiff, frozen, pale, Their smirks were gone. She met their eyes for just a heartbeat. Then she began to speak. "Good morning." Her voice was calm, even, clear enough to carry across the hall. "It's an honor to be here," she said. "I graduated from this academy 11 years ago. I know what it feels like to sit where you are, wanting to prove yourself, to be seen, to belong." A pause. "But I also know that belonging isn't given by others. It's built by what you do when no one's watching." Her eyes drifted over the crowd, then back to the 4 young men. None of them could hold her gaze. Leadership isn't about rank, it's about character, about respect, about how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter. The hall was silent, not a cough, not a whisper. "Some of you will learn that lesson early," she said softly. "Some of you the hard way, but all of you will learn it, because that's what this place is for." She didn't name them, she didn't need to. She just let the silence hang for a moment, heavy, suffocating, and then stepped back from the podium as the applause began to build. As she walked off stage, she didn't look back, but she could feel their eyes following her. Shock, guilt, recognition, fear. They knew. And that was enough for now. That night, alone in her office, she stared at the folded flag framed on the wall. Her reflection flickered faintly in the glass. "Dad," she whispered, "you were right. Respect can't be demanded, it has to be lived." She turned off the light. The hallway was quiet. And somewhere, 4 midshipmen sat in their dorm rooms, trying to understand how the woman they'd mocked was now the officer who would decide their future. They had no idea what kind of lesson was coming next. What did they see when they looked at her now? The next morning, the academy seemed to hold its breath. Word had spread fast about the new officer, the decorated combat veteran, the daughter of Admiral Callaway. The midshipmen spoke in whispers between classes, glancing toward the leadership division offices whenever she walked by. Respect, some of it genuine, some of it born of fear, followed her now like a shadow. But Nora didn't want fear, she wanted understanding. She had seen too many officers lead through intimidation, mistaking obedience for loyalty. Her father had once told her, "The real test of leadership isn't when people salute you. It's when they'd follow you even if they didn't have to." That morning she walked the yard quietly, watching the formations march across the parade ground. She passed the very spot where the incident had happened. The sunlight hit the pavement the same way. The flag above still danced in the wind. It looked exactly the same, only now she wasn't invisible. Her reflection appeared faintly in the brass plaque near the steps. She caught herself thinking, what would have happened if I'd shouted back that day? Would they have learned anything, or would she have just proven their bias right? She wasn't sure, but she knew that silence sometimes carried farther than anger ever could. Inside her office, she reviewed training outlines, drills, tactical exercises, leadership seminars. Her job now was to design and oversee the program that would define how these midshipmen would lead their sailors one day. But every time she looked at a schedule, her thoughts drifted back to those 4 faces. Carter, Enzo, Devon, Hayes. They'd been in the audience yesterday. She'd seen the shock, the disbelief, the pale color draining from their skin. They knew. And she knew they wouldn't sleep easy until they faced her. By the afternoon, the knock came. 4 slow, hesitant raps on the door. "Enter," she said, not looking up from her desk. The door opened. Boots echoed against the floor. When she raised her eyes, the 4 of them stood there in full uniform, covers tucked under their arms. They looked smaller now, not in size but in certainty. "Ma'am," Carter said, his voice was tight, "request permission to speak." She gestured toward the 2 chairs in front of her desk. "Sit." They did, all 4, though the space only had room for 2. Devon and Hayes remained standing at attention behind the others. For a moment no one spoke. The silence was thick enough to touch. Then Carter took a breath. "Ma'am, what happened the other day was unacceptable. There's no excuse for it. We disrespected you, the uniform, this institution." His throat worked as he swallowed. "We owe you an apology." Nora didn't respond. She just watched them, expression neutral, tone unreadable. Her silence made them shift uneasily. Enzo spoke next. "We didn't know who you were, ma'am, but that doesn't matter. We should have treated you with respect regardless." Devon nodded quickly, his voice low. "We were wrong completely." And then Hayes, the one who hadn't said a word during the entire encounter that day, lifted his head. His voice was quieter, but it trembled with something real. "My father served with Admiral Callaway. He told me once your dad was the best officer he ever worked for. I didn't realize you were his daughter until yesterday. I'm ashamed of what I did, ma'am." Nora leaned back slightly in her chair. Her hands were clasped, resting on the desk. For a long moment she said nothing. Then softly she asked, "Do you know what made my father a good officer, Hayes?" He blinked. "Ma'am." "It wasn't his rank, it wasn't his medals." She paused, her gaze cutting through them. "It was how he treated people, whether they wore stripes or none at all." The four midshipmen nodded quickly. She could see the guilt written in their posture, but guilt alone wasn't enough. Anyone could apologize. Few could learn. "You're right," she continued. "What you did was unacceptable. But here what matters now, you came here, you owned it. That takes courage. And courage," she said quietly, "is where leadership begins." They relaxed slightly, as if the storm had passed. But then her tone changed. "Don't mistake forgiveness for the absence of consequence." Their eyes widened. "You will each receive formal counseling," she continued. "Your company officers will be notified, and I'll be submitting a report to the commandant. You'll undergo leadership remediation for the next 6 months. Every decision, every interaction, every report, documented and reviewed. If you fail to meet the standard, I'll recommend separation from the program." No one spoke, even the air felt still. Finally Carter nodded. "Understood, ma'am." "Good," Nora said, "because leadership is not about pretending to be strong. It's about choosing to do the right thing when no one's clapping for you." She let the words settle. Then she dismissed them with a quiet, "That'll be all." They stood, saluted, and walked out. When the door closed, the silence came back, thicker this time. Nora sat there for a long moment, staring at the wall, her heart heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Vindication wasn't what she felt. Not satisfaction. Just sadness. Because she'd seen that look before, the look of realization, the sting of shame. She'd worn it herself once, years ago, standing on the deck of a destroyer with a senior chief tearing into her for a decision that had nearly cost lives. She'd been proud back then, too proud, and the lesson had burned deep. That was the day she'd learned what leadership really meant. And now it was her turn to pass that lesson on. The weeks that followed were quiet, methodical. Nora oversaw the tactical training program, spending long days observing exercises from the control tower, watching how midshipmen handled pressure. She didn't single anyone out publicly. She didn't need to. But the four who had disrespected her could feel her presence in every debrief, every evaluation session. Carter led a navigation drill one morning, his team struggling to keep formation under simulated contact. His voice trembled slightly when he gave orders. Nora stood at the back of the control room, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. When the exercise ended, she approached him. "Carter," she said, "you hesitated when your team needed direction. Why?" He straightened. "Ma'am, I wasn't sure whether to proceed with maneuver delta or hold position. I didn't want to make the wrong call." She nodded slowly. "And while you hesitated, you left your team in uncertainty. You know what uncertainty breeds, midshipmen." He swallowed. "Doubt, ma'am." "Worse," she said softly, "fear." She let the silence hang before she continued. "Fear in command is contagious. If you ever want to lead sailors, you need to make peace with mistakes. You'll make them, I promise you. What matters is how you own them and how fast you recover." Carter nodded, jaw tight. "Yes, ma'am." As he walked away, she saw something different in him. Not arrogance, not fear, just thoughtfulness. That was a start. Later that week, during a leadership ethics seminar, Nora asked a question that made the entire room fall silent. "What do you think breaks trust faster, failure or dishonesty?" Hands went up. She pointed to Enzo. "Dishonesty, ma'am," he said quickly, "because once it's gone, you can't rebuild it." Nora tilted her head. "Can't you?" Enzo hesitated. "Maybe over time." She nodded. "Time helps, but truth rebuilds faster. The question is, how many of you are willing to admit the truth before you're forced to?" The room stayed quiet. A few looked down at their desks. She saw it, the guilt still lingering behind their eyes, but this was how growth began. One uncomfortable silence at a time. That night, alone again in her office, Nora opened her father's old leather notebook. The edges were worn, the pages filled with his handwriting, lessons, quotes, fragments from years at sea. She flipped through until she found the line she'd been searching for. "Respect isn't about titles. It's about consistency when no one's watching." She closed the book gently, her thumb resting on the edge. He'd written that when she was 12. She remembered him sitting at the kitchen table on base housing, uniform unbuttoned at the collar, pen scratching across the page. She used to think he was writing orders. She hadn't known he was writing wisdom. She glanced up at the flag in the shadow box again. The gold thread glimmered faintly under the desk lamp. "Dad," she whispered, "I think they're starting to learn." 2 months later, progress showed itself in quiet ways. Carter had begun volunteering as a peer mentor for younger cadets. Enzo stayed late to help his unit with reports. Devon, once the loudest of the group, listened more than he spoke. Even Hayes had changed, reserved, thoughtful, often staying behind after drills to clean up without being asked. Nora noticed, she always noticed. One evening, after a long day of evaluations, she walked past the chapel and saw them standing outside, talking softly. She didn't approach. She just listened from a distance. Carter was saying, "You ever think about that day, the one with her?" Hayes exhaled. "Every damn time I see her, it's like it happened yesterday." Devon muttered, "I still can't believe she didn't report us to the board." "She did enough," Enzo said quietly, "and we deserved worse." Silence followed. Then Hayes spoke again. "You know what kills me? She didn't even yell, just looked at us, like she expected better." Carter nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why it hurts more." Nora turned away before they could see her. She didn't need to hear more. That was enough. Sometimes the hardest lessons weren't taught in classrooms or field drills. Sometimes they were taught in silence, in the weight of one's own conscience. Weeks later, during the midshipman evaluation board, Nora stood before the senior officers, reviewing the candidates for graduation. Each midshipman's record was projected on the screen. When the 4 names appeared, she paused. "Any issues with these?" the commandant asked, glancing at her. Nora looked at the files, disciplinary notes, counseling reports, leadership evaluations. All marked improved. She took a slow breath. "No issues, sir," she said. "They've learned what they needed to learn." He nodded. "Good. Sometimes the ones who stumble early make the best officers later." She smiled faintly. "If they remember what made them stumble." That night, long after the meeting ended, Nora sat alone on the bleachers overlooking the quiet parade ground. The wind carried the faint hum of the river and the whisper of distant voices from the dorms. She closed her eyes. For the first time since arriving, she felt peace. Not pride, not vindication, just quiet acceptance. Because sometimes, leadership wasn't about proving yourself. Sometimes, it was about letting others see the cost of their mistakes and giving them a chance to rebuild. And as she stood to leave, she realized something simple, something her father would have said if he were there. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. What happens when respect is tested under fire? The exercise was supposed to be routine, a leadership field simulation, 48 hours of tactical drills in the mock combat zone outside the Naval Academy training grounds. But Nora knew that leadership was rarely tested in comfort. It revealed itself in exhaustion, hunger, and silence, the places where pride had no strength left to hide behind. The operation was called Trident Echo. It would be the capstone evaluation for the first-class midshipmen, the final test before graduation. Nora had designed it herself. The parameters were simple. 4 squads, each led by a senior midshipman, would execute a simulated hostage recovery under radio silence and shifting conditions. Points for teamwork, adaptability, and integrity. No shortcuts, no room for arrogance. And among those squad leaders were Carter, Enzo, Devon, and Hayes. When the roster was finalized, a few instructors raised eyebrows. "You sure you want all 4 in the same exercise, ma'am?" one of them asked quietly, given the history. Nora's response was calm. "History, what this test is for." That morning, as the teams assembled on the tarmac, Nora watched from the command tent. She wore her duty uniform, headset resting around her neck, clipboard in hand. The air smelled of damp earth and diesel. Distant thunder grumbled across the bay, rain on the way. The midshipmen adjusted gear, checked maps, tightened boots. Some looked nervous, most tried to hide it. Carter approached her briefly, saluting. "Ma'am, all units accounted for." She nodded. "Remember what we talked about during prep?" "Yes, ma'am. Lead by example, communicate. Don't assume respect, earn it." "Good," she said quietly. "Now go prove it." He hesitated a moment before turning away, and for just a second she caught the flicker of something new in his eyes. Not fear, not defiance, just determination. The whistle blew. Trident Echo commence. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The squads navigated the wooded terrain, following coordinates to locate mock hostages, while avoiding patrol teams posing as enemy sentries. Nora monitored their progress through GPS pings and periodic drone feeds. Her instructors logged every decision made by the team leaders. By dusk, a light rain had begun to fall, steady, cold, the kind that seeped into your bones. Radio updates crackled through the comms tent. Echo team reporting. Hostage recovered, moving to extraction zone. Copy that. Delta team encountering terrain blockage, rerouting. Nora tracked each voice on the board until one fell silent. Carter's team. Call sign Falcon 1. Their last transmission had been 20 minutes ago, then nothing. She frowned slightly and adjusted her headset. Falcon 1, this is Control. Radio check. Over. Static. She waited, tried again. Falcon 1, respond. Nothing but the hum of interference. She turned toward the communications officer. Check their GPS. He typed rapidly, then froze. "Ma'am, their tracker showing offline." Nora's jaw tightened. Offline or disabled? Hard to say. Last ping was near Grid 7, Western Ridgeline. She looked at the map. The western ridge was steep, rocky, and flooded after heavy rain, not ideal terrain for a green squad. She grabbed her cap and rain jacket. "I'll go." The instructor moved to stop her. "Ma'am, we can dispatch." "Negative," she said firmly. "They're my responsibility." She stepped into the rain. The storm hit harder as she climbed the ridge trail. Mud slicked beneath her boots, the wind slapping sheets of rain across her face. Her flashlight cut through the dark in trembling beams. Every few meters, she called into the handheld radio. "Falcon 1, this is Commander Callaway. Respond." Still nothing. Lightning cracked across the sky, revealing a flicker of movement ahead. shadows, figures huddled beneath a tarp near the tree line. Nora slowed, hand resting on her sidearm out of instinct, though this wasn't a combat zone. It was training, controlled, supposedly safe. Until she heard it, one of them coughing hard. Another voice muttered, "We can't move him, his leg's bad." Nora stepped closer, Falcon 1. Heads turned. Carter blinked up at her through the rain, face smeared with mud. Enzo was crouched beside Devon, whose leg was wrapped in a soaked bandage. "Ma'am," Carter snapped to attention instinctively, though his uniform was dripping. We lost comms." Devon slipped down the embankment, possible fracture. Nora crouched beside Devon. The bandage was makeshift but clean. They'd stabilized the leg with a branch in their belts. "Who did this?" she asked. "Hayes, ma'am," Carter said. "Used his field knife and first aid kit." Hayes looked up, eyes wide. "Ma'am, we couldn't leave him." Nora nodded slightly. "You did the right thing." She radioed the control tent, relaying their coordinates. "Medical team inbound," came the response. "ETA, 10 minutes." But 10 minutes in the cold rain could stretch into forever. Nora took a breath and looked at them, mud-caked, shivering, exhausted. And yet not panicked, not laughing, just 4 young men learning what leadership really costs. "Tell me what happened," she said. Carter explained. "We were ahead of schedule when we hit the ridgeline. Devon slipped, fell down the slope about 20 feet. Comms pack got damaged in the fall, lost signal. We tried to carry him out, but terrain was too steep, so we set up shelter and waited." Nora studied their faces. They expected reprimand, maybe disappointment. Instead, she said quietly, "You made the right call, you adapted, you stayed with your teammate, that's leadership." Carter blinked, "Ma'am." She gestured toward Devon. "Out here, the mission is secondary to the people. You can replace plans, you can't replace lives." The rain softened to a drizzle as medics arrived, loading Devon onto a stretcher. He gave her a weak thumbs up before they carried him away. When they were gone, Nora turned to the remaining 3. "Walk with me," she said. They followed her down the muddy trail, silent except for the crunch of wet gravel beneath their boots. The forest around them glistened, rainwater dripping from leaves. The air smelled of wet pine and diesel from the medical transport. Finally, Nora spoke. "Do you know what I was thinking when I saw you the day you spit on me?" The question froze them mid-step. Hayes swallowed hard. "Ma'am, She raised a hand. "I'm not asking for apology. I'm telling you what I thought." They waited, heads bowed. "I thought," she said softly, "that someday you'd need to lead people through something like this. When things go wrong, when someone gets hurt, when the plan falls apart, and you'd finally understand what respect actually means." They said nothing. "I was right." She turned toward them, rain glinting in her hair like cold steel. "Leadership isn't about power, it's about presence, about who you are when someone else is bleeding and looks to you for steadiness. You gave me that tonight. You gave him that. Don't forget how it feels." The 3 midshipmen stood motionless in the rain. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. When they finally reached the base camp, Nora paused at the gate. "Go clean up. Debrief tomorrow at 700. They saluted. She nodded once, and for the first time since meeting them, her tone softened. "Good work today." Their eyes widened slightly. It was the first time she'd said those words to them. They turned and disappeared into the barracks. Nora stood alone for a long time, staring out at the rain-soaked field, the thunder rolling in the distance. Her hands were cold, but her heart was steady. Because in that moment, she realized something she hadn't admitted to herself until now. They weren't the only ones learning. Later that night, she sat at her desk, damp uniform replaced by a sweatshirt, hair tied back loosely. Her after-action report glowed on the screen, cursor blinking beside the last line. Falcon 1 encountered critical casualty and executed adaptive response under duress. demonstrated integrity and prioritization of team welfare over mission objective. Recommendation, commendation for leadership under pressure. She hesitated before saving it, because writing those words felt like closing a loop that began weeks ago, one that started with disrespect but ended with understanding. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. "Come in," she said. It was Carter. He stood at attention, uniform cleaned, face still tired from the field. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For not giving up on us." She regarded him for a moment. "You earned your own redemption, Carter. I just made sure you had the chance." He nodded, hesitating before turning to leave. "Ma'am." "Yes. When I graduate," he said softly, "I hope I can lead like you." Nora smiled faintly. "Then you'll lead better than I did." He blinked, unsure if she was serious. Then he nodded again and left. Nora leaned back in her chair, staring at the folded flag on the wall. The edges of the shadow box caught the lamplight, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was living in her father's shadow. She was living his lesson. She whispered, barely audible, "You were right again, Dad. Respect isn't about how they treat you. It's about how you teach them to treat others." Outside, the rain stopped. The night grew quiet. And somewhere in the barracks, 4 young men who once mocked her were now writing in their journals, describing what real leadership looked like. None of them would ever forget that night on the ridge. Nora knew that much for certain. What happens when doing the right thing comes at a cost? 3 weeks after the Trident Echo exercise, Nora sat in a high-ceilinged conference room beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly like an anxious heartbeat. The air smelled of stale coffee and old reports. On the wall behind her, framed photographs of former commandants lined the wood paneling, men with hard eyes, clean uniforms, perfect posture. Across the table sat Captain Rourke, the deputy commandant of the academy. His jaw was square, his ribbons heavy, and his expression unreadable. To his right, a civilian from the Department of Naval Education scrolled through a report on his tablet. Between them sat Nora's after-action summary, 12 pages detailing every squad's performance during the Trident Echo simulation. Rourke didn't look up when he spoke. "Your report commends Midshipman Carter's unit for leadership under pressure." "Yes, sir," Nora replied. Her voice was calm, controlled. "They demonstrated initiative and integrity under duress." He leaned back slowly. "Integrity's a fine word, Commander, but there's a question of judgment here. They went off comms, broke radio protocol. That could have been catastrophic in an actual combat situation." "They didn't choose to go dark," she said evenly. "Their comms unit was damaged. They stabilized an injured teammate and held position until help arrived." Rourke's gaze sharpened. "You're saying you approve of a decision to abort mission objectives?" "I'm saying," Nora replied, "that they prioritized their people over their points." Silence. The civilian glanced up from his tablet. "Commander Callaway, the Academy prides itself on producing leaders who complete their mission, regardless of adversity." She nodded. "And the Navy loses ships when officers believe mission means ignoring humanity." The room went still. Rourke's expression hardened, but there was something else beneath it, faint respect, buried under bureaucracy. He sighed. "I read your file, Callaway. Impressive record. Surface warfare officer, multiple combat deployments, commendation for saving a cruiser during the Hormuz engagement." Nora said nothing. She didn't need to. He continued, "You've earned your place here, but this academy isn't a destroyer under missile fire. It's an institution, and institutions survive on order." Nora met his gaze evenly. "Order without empathy becomes obedience, sir, and obedience without judgment kills sailors." The civilian raised an eyebrow. "Is that a quote from your father?" She hesitated. "No, that one's mine." The man smiled faintly, but Rourke didn't. Be careful, Commander. Admirable idealism has a way of turning into insubordination. Her voice stayed soft, but there was steel beneath it. With respect, sir, ideals are what make us different from machines. Rourke leaned forward, his tone quieter now. You've built quite the reputation among the midshipmen, Callaway. They listen to you. Some of the instructors think you're coddling them. I think you're making them think. That's not a criticism, but it's unconventional. Leadership is unconventional, sir. It's not one size fits all. He studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. I'll approve the commendation for Carter's team, but understand, Commander, your methods are being watched. Nora stood saluting. Understood, sir. As she turned to leave, Rourke's voice followed her. Your father used to sit in that chair. He argued with me just like this every damn time. She paused at the door. Then maybe some lessons run in the family. And then she walked out. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the courtyard like a wash of gold over white marble. The noise of cadets drilling echoed across the yard. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing in the salt-sweet air of the Chesapeake. Her father had always said institutions were like ships. They carried you forward, but they could crush you if you forgot how to steer. And right now, she could feel the undertow. That evening, she sat alone in her quarters, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Her father's leather-bound notebook lay open again beside her, a ritual now. She ran her thumb along the margin of a page that read, There will come a day when you have to choose between being liked and being right. Choose right, every time. Her eyes burned slightly. You made it sound so simple, Dad, she whispered, but it never is. The following week, the Academy hosted an inspection from Fleet Command. It was an event of pomp and scrutiny, senior officers in dress whites, speeches about legacy and excellence, rehearsed smiles for photographs. Nora walked the courtyard with the visiting officers, answering their questions, keeping her tone measured. But her focus wasn't on the ceremony. It was on the cadets who moved like clockwork behind the scenes, the same ones who had learned, stumbled, and grown over the past months. She spotted Carter and Hayes overseeing logistics near the parade ground. They worked with quiet precision, no swagger, no laziness, just discipline born of humility. She caught Carter's eye briefly. He straightened, saluted. She nodded once, faint approval, then turned back to the brass-filled conversation around her. When the Admiral from Fleet Command, an older man with silver hair and eyes like a storm, began his speech, Nora stood among the staff at the edge of the platform. His words were what she expected: tradition, duty, service. But then he said something that pulled her focus. Leadership, he declared, is about the chain of command, the willingness to follow before you can ever lead. Those who question that chain weaken it. Murmurs of approval rippled through the ranks. Nora's jaw tightened slightly. She could almost hear her father's voice answering in her head. The chain of command exists to lift others, not bind them. When the speech ended, the Admiral shook hands with the instructors. When he reached Nora, his grip was firm. Lieutenant Commander Callaway, I've heard of your father. Yes, sir. He was a good man, respected, never confused authority with friendship. No, sir, she said quietly, he didn't. The Admiral nodded. Keep that in mind. The Navy needs fewer friends and more order. She smiled politely, but something inside her recoiled. Fewer friends and more order. She'd seen what that kind of thinking produced: captains who silenced truth, commanders who buried mistakes to preserve hierarchy, crews who followed orders into flames. Later, after the Admiral's entourage departed, Nora walked alone along the seawall. The evening light spilled over the water, soft and fatting. The air was heavy with the sound of gulls and distant laughter from cadets unwinding after inspection. She leaned on the railing, staring at the horizon. Respect through fear lasts a day. Respect through example lasts a lifetime. Her father had written that too. She'd never believed it more than she did now. The next morning, a message waited on her desk, sealed, stamped with official insignia. From Deputy Commandant Captain Rourke. Subject: Leadership Methods Review. Commander Callaway. Recent reports indicate that certain cadets are adopting unorthodox interpretations of command hierarchy following your instruction. While your results are commendable, your philosophy may not align with standardized naval leadership doctrine. You are requested to provide a formal defense of your methods at the upcoming instructor review panel. Rourke. Nora set the paper down slowly. Her chest tightened. It wasn't anger. It was that heavy, familiar ache, the one that came whenever principle met politics. She closed her eyes and took a steady breath. She knew what this was, a warning shot, the kind that preceded a quiet transfer, a career stall, or a forced reassignment under the guise of professional alignment. She opened her eyes, stared at the flag in the shadow box, and whispered, "You told me this day would come." The review panel convened 3 days later. 5 officers sat behind the table, uniformed, stone-faced, waiting. Nora stood at the center of the room, spine straight, voice steady. They questioned her for an hour, about her decisions during training, about her disciplinary methods, about Trident Echo, about Carter's team and the consequences she'd chosen. Finally, one of them, an older commander, leaned forward. "Lieutenant Commander Callaway, do you believe you're above naval doctrine?" She met his eyes calmly. "No, sir. I believe doctrine should serve leadership, not replace it." Another officer frowned. "You've been described as emotionally driven in your approach." She didn't flinch. "Emotions are what separate us from machines, sir. Discipline without empathy breeds compliance, not courage." Silence. Pens stopped moving. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. Rourke, seated at the center, finally spoke. "And what would you say, Commander, to those who claim you've blurred the line between professionalism and sentiment?" Nora's voice dropped to a whisper, firm, deliberate. "I'd say that line doesn't exist when you're writing letters to parents after a mission goes wrong." The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then Rourke nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. "You've made your point, Commander." When she walked out, the hall felt different, lighter, or maybe she just was. That evening, she found a note under her office door. "Ma'am, we heard about the review. If they don't see what you've done for us, they're blind. We'll carry your lessons wherever we go. Carter and Zoe Devon Hayes." She held the paper for a long moment, thumb pressed against the ink. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside her father's notebook, between 2 pages that spoke of courage. The next day, Rourke called her in. "Commander," he said simply, "the panel cleared you. No action taken." She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." He hesitated. "You won, Callaway. Don't let it turn into bitterness." She smiled faintly. "No, sir, just clarity." He exhaled, shaking his head with something that almost resembled admiration. "Your father would have been proud." Nora's gaze softened. "He already is, sir. I just had to earn it." She left the office quietly, sunlight spilling across the corridor as she stepped outside. The academy bells began to ring across the yard, echoing against the water. She stood there for a long moment, eyes closed, listening. Leadership was never about standing taller than others. It was about standing firm when everything around you tried to make you kneel. And that day, Nora Callaway didn't kneel. She didn't shout, she didn't argue. She just lived the lesson her father left her. That dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. How do you teach courage when you're the one who has to live it? The orders came quietly, with no ceremony, no fanfare, just a manila envelope left on Nora's desk one morning. She stared at it for a long time before opening it, feeling that faint, familiar pulse of tension in her fingertips, the one that came before deployment. Temporary duty assignment, Joint Maritime Task Group 17. Location, Eastern Mediterranean. Duration, 60 days. Role, Field Operations Observer, Leadership Integration. She read it twice, then folded the papers neatly back inside. It had been years since she'd last stepped aboard a combat vessel. The sounds of metal corridors and distant sonar still lived in her bones, but the idea of going back, even temporarily, stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not excitement, just wait. That evening she stood by her window, looking out over the river as dusk settled over the academy grounds. The sound of midshipmen marching echoed faintly through the air. Their cadence, their confidence, it was all built on the lessons she tried to teach them. Now it's my turn, she thought, to prove I still believe them. 2 weeks later, Nora found herself standing on the deck of the USS Harrington, a guided missile destroyer slicing through Mediterranean waters under a haze of pale dawn. The air was warm, salted, alive with quiet power. The ship was part of a NATO-led security task group, conducting joint patrols near a volatile coastline where piracy and militia skirmishes had recently spiked. Officially, Nora's assignment was to observe and evaluate command dynamics under stress. Unofficially, she knew what that meant, to watch how leaders broke, bent, or rose when things got real. Captain Rhodes, the ship's commanding officer, greeted her at the quarterdeck, tall, late 40s, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who measured people before he spoke. His handshake was firm. "Lieutenant Commander Callaway," he said, "heard you're the Academy's new philosopher." She smiled faintly. "I just teach people not to forget they're human, sir." He grinned. "Careful, out here that'll get you called soft. Then maybe they've forgotten what real strength looks like." That earned her a look, half amused, half curious. "Fair enough," he said. "Welcome aboard." The days fell into rhythm. Patrols, drills, debriefs. Nora watched everything, how the officers treated their crew, how decisions formed under pressure, how small mistakes grew if left unchecked. The Harrington was a good ship, disciplined, professional, but like any command, cracks appeared under strain. She saw it first in the way the XO, Lieutenant Commander Briggs, snapped at junior officers, short temper, fast judgment, little empathy. It wasn't malicious, just careless, the kind of leadership born from survival, not trust. And the crew responded accordingly. They obeyed, but they didn't believe. On the fourth night, Nora joined the watch in Combat Information Center. The room hummed with quiet tension, radar screens glowing green, headsets crackling with static. Outside, waves rolled dark under moonlight. "Unidentified contact bearing 52, a petty officer called out. "Speed 6 knots, closing distance." "Visual range?" Briggs asked. "Negative, sir, too much haze." Nora watched the command teamwork, data exchanged, decisions relayed, confidence balancing on the thin line between discipline and instinct. She stayed silent, taking notes. Then, without warning, another voice came through comms, rough, accented, garbled. "Unknown vessel, this is the Al-Sadiq. Do not approach. You are entering restricted waters." The bridge quieted. The captain appeared within seconds, his tone calm but firm. "Helm, maintain course. Communications, broadcast standard identification." They did. Static followed. Then another transmission, this time sharper, more threatening. "Turn away or be engaged." Weapons control went on standby. Nora could feel the atmosphere shift. She'd seen it before, the slow tightening of air before a potential confrontation. Rhodes turned to Briggs. "Get me their flag, AIS data." "Nothing, sir. They're running dark." "Range?" 5 miles and closing." Nora's heart beat steadily, her instincts remembering too well the rhythm of rising tension, the invisible countdown before a choice. "Sir," she said quietly, "permission to observe the bridge." Rhodes nodded. "Stay sharp." Up on the bridge, the sea was calm, eerily so. The horizon glowed faintly with distant coastal lights. Through binoculars, Nora could make out the shadow of a small vessel cutting across the waves. No lights, no transponder, just silence and steel. Rhodes spoke into the headset. "Unknown vessel, this is the United States Navy destroyer Harrington. You are approaching a restricted patrol zone. Alter course immediately." No reply. The small craft kept coming. Briggs muttered, "Could be smugglers or worse." Nora studied the radar screen. "They're moving too directly toward us. That's deliberate." "Evasive?" Briggs asked. Rhodes shook his head. "Hold, I want visual ID." Minutes stretched. Then a flash, not lightning, not reflection, a sudden pulse of light from the small vessel's bow. "Contact flare," someone shouted. "Possible targeting," Briggs barked. "Weapons to defensive posture." The next seconds blurred. Orders snapped. Crew moved. Tension sharpened to a blade, but Nora's eyes were on the captain, calm, centered, unflinching. Then came the sound, a pop from the distance. Small, sharp. "Not a missile," Nora said instantly. "Small arms fire." The flare hadn't been a threat. It had been a warning. Through binoculars, she saw it clearly now. The vessel wasn't a militia ship at all. It was a local fishing trawler, hull patched and rusted, flag tattered. Men on deck waved frantically, shouting over the roar of waves. "They're signaling distress," Nora said. Rhodes hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Helm, reduce speed. Prepare rescue team." Briggs looked skeptical. "Sir, could be bait. We've seen that trick before." "Maybe," Rhodes said. "But if we're wrong, people drown. We'll take that chance." Nora watched as the rescue team launched a small boat, cutting through dark water toward the fishing vessel. The wind carried faint voices, urgent, desperate. Within minutes, they were hauling injured fishermen aboard, one man barely conscious, his arm mangled from snapped rigging. When they returned, Nora helped them carry the wounded inside. Blood, saltwater, diesel, the smells mingled, heavy with humanity. The medical officer took over and Nora stepped back, watching as the sailors worked seamlessly, no questions, no hesitation, just care. Rhodes turned to her quietly. "Still think empathy belongs in leadership, Commander." She smiled faintly. "I think it just saved lives, sir." Later that night, Nora sat on the stern, the sea stretching endless under stars. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only the quiet hum of thought. She'd seen the line again, the one between fear and courage, between assumption and truth. Briggs joined her a few minutes later, leaning on the rail. "Hell of a night," he said. She nodded. He hesitated. "You were right about them not being hostile." "I wasn't guessing," she said softly. "I was remembering." He glanced at her. "From Hormuz." "Yeah, we thought we were under missile lock that night. Turned out to be a heat malfunction. Almost fired preemptively. Would have started a war if we had." He exhaled. "Close call." "Too close. I learned something that night." She looked out at the horizon. "Fear makes leaders loud. Clarity makes them calm." Briggs was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, when I first heard about you, the Admiral's daughter, the Academy reformer, I thought you were one of those idealists who write books about leadership but never bleed for it." She didn't look at him, "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I think you might actually believe it." "I do," she said, "every word." The days that followed blurred together, more patrols, more reports, more small moments of humanity hidden between the steel and protocol. Nora saw change even here, sailors speaking with more openness, officers slowing down before barking orders. Nothing drastic, just quieter, steadier. On the final day of her assignment, Captain Rhodes called her to the wardroom. Papers sat on the table, official transfer orders back to the academy. He offered her a mug of coffee. "You did good work here," he said. "Crew's different lately. You don't even notice it till it's quiet." "Quiet's a good sign," she said, smiling. He nodded. "You ever think of taking command again?" She hesitated. Sometimes, but right now I think I'm supposed to teach. Then keep doing that, Rhodes said. Because out here we forget. The noise, the rank, the routine, it makes us forget what this uniform's supposed to mean. You reminded me. She looked down for a moment, then met his eyes. Thank you, sir. He extended his hand. Safe travels, Commander. As the plane lifted off from the coastal airstrip, Nora looked down at the ocean, vast, endless, indifferent. The same sea she'd crossed countless times before. The same sea her father had once commanded ships upon. She reached into her bag and pulled out his old notebook, flipping to a blank page. The ink glided easily as she wrote. Strength isn't in command, it's in restraint. Power isn't in fear, it's in understanding. And courage isn't born from rank. It's born from compassion. She closed the notebook and stared out the window as the horizon widened before her, blue and bright and infinite. The academy would be waiting. And so would her cadets. Only this time, she wasn't returning to teach them how to lead. She was going to show them what leadership really looked like. What happens when the people you taught start fighting the system you serve. The flight back to Annapolis was quiet. Nora sat by the window, watching clouds drift beneath her like distant memories. The sea had faded to a silver ribbon somewhere far behind. In her lap rested her father's notebook, and on the page she'd written before takeoff, the ink had dried unevenly, smudged slightly by her thumb. When the wheels touched down, she felt the weight return not of rank but of responsibility. The academy wasn't just a place. It was a mirror. It reflected back everything you taught, whether you liked what you saw or not. By the time she walked through the main gate again, autumn had settled in. The air was colder now. The trees around the yard had turned shades of bronze and red. The sound of midshipmen marching in formation carried across the parade ground, sharp, rhythmic, certain. But beneath that rhythm, something felt off. She noticed it in the way conversation stopped when she passed, the way glances lingered a little too long, the undercurrent of tension that even silence couldn't hide. Her instincts prickled. When she reached her office, a note waited on her desk, folded once unsigned. Ma'am, please see me before they do. I see. Carter. Her pulse quickened slightly. She left immediately. She found him in one of the study halls near Bancroft, hunched over a table, uniform jacket off, sleeves rolled up. He stood the moment he saw her. Ma'am, he said quietly. His voice carried a tremor that wasn't fear, it was guilt. What happened? She asked. He glanced around, lowering his voice. Ma'am, there's been an incident during weekend liberty. A few midshipmen got into a fight off base. Civilians involved. The Academy police are investigating. Were you there? He hesitated. Yes, ma'am, but it's not what they think. Nora's tone stayed calm, though her heart sank. Tell me everything. He took a breath. It started at a diner near the marina. We were just having dinner, me, Enzo, Devon, and Hayes. Some civilians came in, a group of guys, maybe mid-20s. They started making jokes about uniforms. Nothing new. We ignored it. But then one of them started talking about you. Nora froze slightly. About me. Yes, ma'am. They said things. Stuff about you and the academy, that you only got where you are because of your father, that you're just another officer playing hero. He clenched his jaw. Hayes told them to stop. They didn't. One of them threw a drink. Devon stepped in. It escalated fast. The police showed up within minutes. No one seriously hurt, but it looks bad. She felt the ache behind her eyes, that dull, weary kind of pain that comes from watching your own lessons collide with human imperfection. You understand how this looks, she said softly. Yes, ma'am, we do. We didn't go there looking for trouble. I know, she studied him carefully. Did any of you throw the first punch? Carter hesitated. No, ma'am, but we didn't walk away either. That was the line, the one every leader eventually faced, the space between pride and principle. "Where are the others now?" she asked. "Confined to quarters until the investigation's done." She nodded slowly. "I'll handle it." By evening, the commandant's office buzzed with quiet outrage. A public incident involving senior midshipmen, potential media attention, was the kind of stain institutions feared most. Nora stood at the end of the long table as senior staff debated discipline, reputation, procedure. Words like conduct unbecoming and liability floated through the air like smoke. Captain Rourke sat at the head of the table, his expression tired. "These four have been under your supervision, Callaway. Any idea why they'd risk their careers over something like this?" She met his gaze evenly. "Because they were provoked, because they're young, and because they still believe in defending what they respect." "That's not an excuse," said one of the officers. "No," Nora agreed. "It's a reason." Rourke leaned forward. "Reason or not, the optics are bad. The superintendent wants recommendations by morning. Expulsion on the table." The words hit harder than she expected. Expulsion. For four cadets who had once spit on her, then learned what respect meant, and now might lose everything for defending hers. Her stomach twisted. She took a breath. "Sir, I'd like to speak with them before the decision is made." Rourke studied her. "You're sure that's wise?" "No," she said softly, "but it's right." The holding room was sterile, a small, windowless space with metal chairs and walls that smelled faintly of disinfectant. The four midshipmen sat in silence, uniforms wrinkled, eyes hollow. When Nora entered, they stood instantly. "At ease," she said. No one spoke. She looked at them one by one: Carter, Enzo, Devon, Hayes. The same four faces that once mocked her, then grew under her watch. Now they looked older, heavier. Real leaders in the making, standing on the edge of losing it all. Carter spoke first. "Ma'am, we're sorry." Nora nodded slightly. "I know, but sorry doesn't erase choices. You could have walked away." "We couldn't," Hayes said, voice tight. "They were," he stopped himself, fists clenching. "They disrespected you, ma'am." "I don't need defending," she said gently. "Not like that." "I know," he said quietly. "But it wasn't about you, not really. It was about what you taught us: respect, integrity, standing up when something's wrong. We just forgot that sometimes standing up means walking away." Nora's throat tightened. She wanted to be angry, but all she felt was sorrow and an odd, painful pride. Because they had learned. They just hadn't learned everything yet. She walked closer, her voice low. "You think leadership is about strength. It's not. It's about control. Anyone can fight. Not everyone can choose not to." They nodded silently. She looked down, collecting her thoughts. "I'll speak to the board in the morning. I can't promise outcomes, but I'll tell the truth." Hayes looked up. "Why would you do that for us, ma'am, after everything?" She met his eyes. "Because leaders don't abandon their people when they make mistakes. That's when they need leadership the most." The next morning, the disciplinary board convened. The superintendent himself was present, a man known for being decisive and cold. Nora stood before him as the four midshipmen waited outside. The board read through the reports, the statements, the police summary. When they finished, the superintendent looked at her. "You've been requested to speak, Commander Callaway. Proceed." Nora stepped forward. "Sir," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I won't defend what they did. They broke discipline. They failed to de-escalate. But I'll tell you what else they did." She paused. "They stood up for an officer who taught them respect, not because they had to, but because they believed it was right. They didn't do it for recognition. They did it because they finally understood what integrity feels like." She let that settle. "If you expel them, you'll send a message that the academy values image more than growth. But if you give them another chance, you'll graduate four officers who have already learned one of the hardest lessons, that honor means nothing if it's only convenient." The room was silent. The superintendent studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You care about them." "I do," she admitted. "Then you understand that care must come with consequence." "I do," she said again, "but consequence isn't the same as destruction." He nodded slowly. "Leave us, Commander." Hours passed. Nora sat in her office, staring at the flag on the wall, the same shadow box that had followed her through every command. She thought about her father, what he would have said. Probably nothing. He'd just stand beside her quietly, that same calm presence that said you did the right thing, even if it costs you. The knock came at dusk. Carter entered, followed by the others. Their faces were unreadable. "Well," she asked. Carter exhaled. "Probation, leadership remediation, no expulsion." She felt her chest ease for the first time in days. "Good." Hayes stepped forward. "They said it was because of you." She shook her head. "No, it was because of who you've become." Devon looked down, emotion catching in his voice. "We don't deserve your faith, ma'am." She smiled faintly. "Faith isn't about deserving. It's about believing someone can still rise after they fall." They stood there in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. Then Carter spoke again, quietly. "Ma'am, when we commission next year, we'd like you to be there." She nodded once. "I'll be there." As they left, she turned toward the window. Outside, the academy lights shimmered across the Severn River. The sky was dark, the water calm, but she could see her reflection faintly, older, steadier, maybe even stronger. Her father's voice seemed to whisper from the back of her mind. "They're your sailors now, Nora. Not by command, by trust." She exhaled slowly. And for the first time since coming back, she allowed herself to feel what she hadn't felt in years, hope. Because leadership, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about forgiveness. About the courage to see the best in people, even after they fail. About standing quietly, unshaken, when the world demands you turn away. And that night, as the bells rang softly across the yard, Nora Callaway whispered to herself the words she'd come to live by. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply endures. What happens when the teacher becomes the one who needs saving? The winter wind swept through Annapolis with a sharp bite, carrying the smell of the sea and cold iron from the shipyards. The academy stood still under gray skies, formal, silent, disciplined as ever. But inside those walls, something had changed. The 4 midshipmen who once walked with arrogance now moved with quiet confidence. They were different, tempered by failure, strengthened by humility. Nora saw it in the way Carter listened to his peers now, the way Enzo deferred to others in planning drills, the way Devon laughed less but meant it more, and the way Hayes seemed to carry an invisible burden of care for everyone around him. They were no longer the cadets who spat on a stranger. They were becoming the kind of leaders she had hoped the Navy would one day deserve. And yet, for Nora, something darker had begun to shadow that pride. It started with a phone call. She was sitting at her desk late one evening, reviewing training evaluations, when her phone buzzed softly beside her. The caller ID was unfamiliar, a number from a naval hospital in Norfolk. "Lieutenant Commander Callaway," a nurse's voice said, gentle but heavy. "Yes. This is Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. I'm afraid your mother has been admitted. Cardiac complications." Nora froze. Her chest tightened as the nurse continued explaining words she barely heard. "Stable for now, observation, request for next of kin." She hung up slowly, staring at the flag in its shadow box. The same folded one she'd received after her father's funeral. For a long time, she couldn't move. She thought she'd learned to handle loss. But grief wasn't something you mastered, it was something you carried. The next morning, she was gone before sunrise. No uniform, no briefings, just a quiet departure from the academy gates. The drive south to Norfolk blurred in a wash of gray highway and colder memories. When she reached the hospital, the sterile light and quiet beeping of machines hit her harder than she expected. Her mother lay in bed, pale, smaller somehow. Time had done what no storm or battle could. "Nora," her mother whispered weakly, smiling, "you didn't have to come." "I did," Nora said softly, sitting beside her. "I always do." Her mother's hand was warm in hers but frail. "Your father used to say that. Every time the Navy called him away. I have to go, Laura. It's my duty." Nora smiled faintly. "You used to hate that." Her mother chuckled weakly. "I did, but I loved him more for it." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of heart monitors steady and unrelenting. Finally, her mother said quietly, "He'd be proud of you, you know." Nora looked down. "I don't know, I'm not sure I've done enough." Her mother shook her head slowly. "You've done more than enough. You're teaching others how to be good, not just good officers, but good people. That's all your father ever wanted." Nora swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I just hope I'm not failing them." "You'll only fail them," her mother said, "if you stop believing in what you teach." She stayed 2 days, long enough for her mother's condition to stabilize. Before leaving, she stood in the hallway outside the ward, staring out at the hospital's American flag flapping against a winter sky. The memory of her father's funeral folded into the present that same ache, that same resolve. When she returned to the academy, it was late evening. The yard was silent, lit by the soft glow of floodlights. As she approached her office, she found someone waiting by the door. "Carter." He snapped to attention when he saw her. "Ma'am." "At ease," she said, surprised. "What are you doing here this late?" He hesitated. "We heard you were gone. Hayes called the hospital to check. We just wanted to make sure you were okay." She smiled faintly. "I didn't know I had spies." "Not spies, ma'am," he said, serious now. "Just people who care." The words caught her off guard. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that somewhere between punishment and perseverance, these young men had become something closer to family. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." He nodded. "We'll take care of things here, ma'am, don't worry." She laughed softly. "That's my line, Carter." Over the next weeks, life returned to its rhythm. Winter drills continued. Exams came and went. The final leadership field exercise loomed, their last before commissioning. It was designed to push them harder than ever. A live sea survival test, combining navigation, teamwork, and endurance in open waters off the Academy coast. Each team would operate under simulated failure conditions, forced to adapt with minimal resources. And of course, Carter's squad would lead one of them. Nora didn't tell them. She'd been asked to oversee it personally. On the morning of the exercise, the wind was sharp, and waves rolled choppy against the gray horizon. The cadets assembled on the pier in full gear, wetsuits, vests, determination in their eyes. Nora stood on the command deck of the observation vessel, binoculars slung around her neck. She watched as teams deployed into the water in small craft, the distant hum of motors cutting through the cold. By midday, a light drizzle began, the kind that whispered warnings before storms. "Ma'am," one of the instructors said quietly beside her, "weather's worsening, should we call it?" Nora studied the horizon. The clouds were thickening, but the waves were still manageable. "Not yet. They've trained for this." She scanned the sea again. Carter's boat was near the far side of the course, small, distant, bobbing against the swells. Through binoculars, she saw Hayes at the helm, Enzo navigating, Devon monitoring signals. Everything was controlled, steady. Until it was. "Ma'am," the radar tech called. "Signal drop on Team Bravo, that's Carter's group." Transponder went offline. Nora's stomach sank. "Confirm." "Confirmed. Last ping, 2 clicks east of marker 3. The wind picked up sharply, waves climbing higher. She turned to the instructor. "Get a fast boat ready." "Ma'am, they're trained too." "Now," she snapped, sharper than usual, "we're not waiting." Within minutes, she was in the rescue craft, spray stinging her face as they cut through churning water. Every instinct screamed warnings, the same instincts she'd trusted in combat, the same ones that had saved lives before. As they rounded the last marker, she saw it, the overturned boat, floating half-submerged, gear scattered, no movement nearby. "Over there," someone shouted. A flash of orange, a life vest, then another. The crew pulled 2 cadets aboard first, coughing, shivering, alive. Hayes and Devon. "Where Carter?" Nora demanded. Hayes pointed weakly toward the waves. He went under trying to cut Enzo free, rope tangled. Nora didn't wait, she dove. The cold hit like a blade, instant, paralyzing. She kicked downward, vision blurring in the dark water. Shapes moved beneath, a flailing arm, the glint of a buckle. She reached him, Carter, struggling to free Enzo from the tangle of rope wrapped around the overturned hull. The current fought her, pulling them sideways. She grabbed her knife, cut the line, and together they shot upward, gasping as they broke the surface. "Boat over here," she shouted hoarsely. Strong hands reached down, hauling them in. Carter collapsed, coughing water, Enzo barely conscious. Nora sat back, drenched, trembling not from cold, but from the rush of relief that hit like a wave of its own. Carter looked up weakly. "Ma'am, everyone okay?" She nodded, smiling despite herself. "You did good, Carter." He laughed once, breathless, exhausted. "Didn't mean to give you a heart attack, ma'am." "Too late," she said softly. Hours later, after the cadets had been treated for hypothermia and cleared by medics, Nora sat alone in the infirmary corridor. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her heavy, drained. Captain Rourke appeared quietly beside her, heard what happened. "They're fine," she said, voice low. "Just bad weather and tangled ropes." Rourke folded his arms. "Could have gone worse." She nodded slowly. "Could have, but they didn't freeze, they didn't panic, they led." He studied her for a long moment. "Looks like you taught them well." She looked away. "No, sir, they taught me." Rourke raised an eyebrow. "Taught you what?" "That you can't train heart. You can only inspire it." He gave a quiet, thoughtful nod. "And what about yourself, Callaway? Still believe in your methods?" She smiled faintly, now more than ever. That night she walked the empty pier alone. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clear. The moon hung over the still water, its reflection shimmering like a heartbeat. She leaned against the railing, eyes closed, whispering to the quiet. "Dad, you were right again. Respect isn't earned once. It's earned every day." Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Hayes. "Ma'am," he said softly, "Carter's awake. He wanted me to tell you something." "What's that?" He said, "If he ever gets command one day, he'll remember the officer who jumped in after him." Nora smiled, that rare, quiet kind of smile that carries more pride than any medal. "Tell him," she said, "the real lesson isn't that I jumped. It's that I knew he would have done the same." Because leadership, she realized, wasn't about saving others. It was about believing they'd learn to save each other. And as the wind picked up again across the dark sea, Nora Callaway stood alone on the pier, not as the woman they'd once disrespected, but as the kind of leader who no longer needed to prove anything. She already had. How do you know when a mission is complete? Spring crept over the academy like a slow exhale. The snow melted from the rooftops, the river turned from gray to blue, and the parade grounds bloomed with color again. The air smelled of cut grass and salt water, just as it had the day she first arrived, the day a group of cadets laughed at a woman they didn't recognize. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, those same cadets stood on the threshold of graduation. The yard buzzed with preparations. Rows of white chairs faced the main stage, banners snapped in the breeze. Families arrived from across the country, proud, anxious, trying to spot their sons and daughters in the sea of uniforms. Nora moved through the crowd quietly, clipboard in hand, coordinating logistics one last time. She wasn't on the program, not officially. Her role was behind the scenes, ensuring the ceremony ran without flaw. That was fine with her. She'd never needed the spotlight. But everyone who mattered knew. This was her class, her cadets, and today would close the circle. Inside Bancroft Hall, the four stood together: Carter, Hayes, Enzo, and Devon, adjusting collars, checking medals, hearts pounding. Their uniforms were immaculate. Their faces carried the stillness of men who had seen both pride and shame and survived both. When Nora entered, conversation stopped. They turned and straightened instinctively. "At ease," she said, smiling faintly. "You look ready." "Ma'am," Carter said, voice low but steady, "we wanted to thank you before it all starts." "For what?" she asked. "For everything," Hayes said, "for not giving up on us." Enzo added, "You taught us how to lead, but more than that, how to respect." Nora's smile softened. "Respect isn't a lesson, it's a choice, one you'll make every day, long after you leave here." Devon's voice cracked slightly. "We won't forget, ma'am." She nodded. "Then I've done my job." They saluted. She returned it. The sound of their heels against the tile echoed down the corridor like the closing of a story. The ceremony began under a perfect blue sky. Brass gleamed. The band played softly as the commandant took the stage, delivering the same words every graduating class heard: duty, honor, courage. But today the words felt different. Because among the cadets sat four young men whose journey had rewritten what those words meant for her, for the academy, maybe for everyone watching. When their names were called, Nora watched from the sidelines. Each one crossed the stage with quiet pride, saluted sharply, and received his commission. When Carter's turn came, he paused halfway across, searching the crowd. Their eyes met. No words, no smile, just understanding. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled into the courtyard. Families embraced. Cameras flashed. Laughter replaced the years of drills and exhaustion. Nora stayed on the edge of it all, watching. She liked this part, the joy that didn't belong to her but felt earned all the same. Rourke found her there, hands behind his back, eyes scanning the horizon. "You did good work, Callaway." "They did the work, sir," she said. He smirked. "That's what good officers always say." They stood in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. Then he said quietly, "You ever think about moving on, maybe a command of your own again?" She looked at the cadets laughing across the yard. "I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be." He nodded. "Then the Navy's lucky." She smiled faintly. "No, sir, I'm lucky. I got to see the next generation do better than we did." Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the courtyard emptied, she found herself alone on the steps of Bancroft Hall. The distant sound of gulls and waves carried through the warm breeze. Carter approached, cap tucked under his arm, a quiet determination in his stride. He stopped a few feet away. "Permission to speak, ma'am." "Granted." He hesitated, then said, "We've all been assigned to the same ship, the Harrington." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "The Harrington?" "Yes, ma'am. Captain Rhodes requested us. Said he wanted officers who understand leadership beyond orders." Nora exhaled softly, a small laugh escaping. "Then he's getting the best crew he could ask for." Carter smiled. "We'll make you proud." "You already have." He glanced at her shadow box, visible through the open door behind her. If Admiral Callaway were here, what would he say? She thought for a long moment, then said quietly, "He'd probably tell me to stop talking and start teaching again." They both laughed. Then Carter said, "For what it's worth, ma'am, we didn't just learn how to lead, we learned how to live." She swallowed hard, emotion tightening her chest. "Then remember this, leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about being brave enough to feel and still move forward." He nodded once, saluted one final time and walked away, toward his future, toward the ocean. That evening, Nora visited the chapel. The sunset cast long rays through stained glass, painting the pews in color. She knelt at the front, the air cool and still. From her pocket, she took a small, folded note, the one the cadets had once slipped under her door months ago. "If they don't see what you've done for us, they're blind." She placed it inside her father's notebook and whispered, "They see it now, Dad." When she rose, her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished brass plaque on the wall. "In honor of Rear Admiral James Callaway, for exemplary service and leadership." For the first time, she didn't feel small standing beneath his name. She felt equal, maybe even whole. Outside, the river was still. The lights from the docks reflected like constellations on the surface. She walked down to the pier, her boots clicking softly against the wood. The air was thick with memory, the sound of drills, laughter, echoes of voices long gone. She sat at the edge, the same spot where she'd once stood questioning her worth, her place, her purpose. The wind tugged gently at her hair, carrying the faint hum of music from the distant dorms. For a moment she closed her eyes. She saw it all again, the spit on her collar, the laughter, the humiliation, the long nights of proving herself, the quiet strength of her father, the fire and redemption of 4 young men who'd found their honor through failure. The storms survived, the hearts changed. And she realized something simple, maybe the most important truth of all. That leadership isn't about being saluted. It's about being remembered for how you made others stand taller. Footsteps approached behind her. She didn't turn. "I figured I'd find you here," said a familiar voice. It was Captain Rhodes in civilian clothes now, visiting from deployment. His smile was faint, weathered, the kind of smile only the sea could carve. He handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Letter from the Harrington. Your boys wanted you to have it." She opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded page, covered in signatures and a few uneven lines of handwriting. "Ma'am, we made it through our first deployment. No accidents, no shortcuts. Every decision we made, we asked ourselves, what would Callaway do? We'll carry that question with us wherever we go. Thank you for teaching us that respect isn't commanded. It's earned, lived, and remembered. Fair winds and following seas. Carter and Zoe Devon Hayes." Nora's hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. She stared out at the horizon, where the last line of sun bled into the darkening sea. Rhodes watched her quietly. "You did more than train officers, Callaway. You gave them a compass." She nodded. "Not mine, just one my father left me." They stood there in silence for a long time, the waves lapping gently at the pier. Finally, Rhodes said softly, "So what now?" Nora smiled faintly. "Now, I keep doing what I do best." He tilted his head. "What's that?" "Believing in people who haven't learned to believe in themselves yet." Later that night, she returned to her quarters. The flag still hung in its case, but now beneath it she placed something new, the cadet's letter. It belonged there beside her father's memory. 2 generations of leadership bound by the same thread, integrity. She sat at her desk and wrote in her father's notebook one final entry. "Legacy isn't rank or medals. It's the echo you leave in others when you're gone. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." She closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and let the quiet fill the room. Outside, the academy bell struck midnight, slow, solemn, eternal. And somewhere out on the dark sea, 4 young officers looked up from their ship's deck, hearing the same faint chime carried across the wind, and smiled. They were no longer the cadets who once spat on a stranger. They were leaders now, a living proof of the lesson she'd taught them. And though they didn't know it, somewhere in her heart, Nora Callaway saluted them back.